When you'd like, Grant, I think we can start.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I think I can see at least 3 time zones here. My name is Grant Parker. I teach at Stanford University. I would like to acknowledge that Stanford University sits on the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. Together with Stefania Manfio of the Stanford Archaeology Center and supported by Stanford Global Studies, I'm hosting this seminar series called Reframing Enslaved Pasts. Today's talk will be the third in a series of 6, the first 2 having focused on Mauritius and the Cape of Good Hope in an Indian Ocean context. Today's topic brings us to Louisiana, and future installments will focus on the intra-American slave trade, on the Senegal Liberations Project, and on material culture in an Atlantic context. A quick word about the overall plan. Big data approaches to the study of enslavement already boast many digital projects and websites focusing predominantly on the Atlantic world, I think it's fair to say. The goal of our series is to bring well-established projects into contact with newer ones. And so it's for that reason that we were so excited to find out about the Louisiana project that we'll be hearing about today. Presenters have been asked to address the following questions. What are the scholarly goals and opportunities driving your research project? What are the affordances and the challenges involved in your chosen approach? How would you characterize your use of databases? With such questions, we aim to facilitate a discussion about critical data practices around enslaved pasts, focusing on methodologies. In the interest of full disclosure, I should say that several of us in this Zoom room, you know who you are, have been involved in projects around the Indian Ocean labor diaspora, including the Cape of Good Hope, supported by SESTA, Stanford's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, and other projects. The seminar series is funded by Stanford Global Studies, which aims to archive these talks for its YouTube channel. So you'll be able to see previous episodes and future ones as well. I hope each attendee is okay with that. We hope the series will engage not only scholars, but also heritage practitioners working in histories and archaeologies of enslavement and other kinds of labor diaspora, and especially those comparing the Indian Ocean, Atlantic, and other systems. Those committed to public-facing humanities, those interested in digital humanities and critical data practices. Today, we're delighted that Professor Bryan Wagner, UC Berkeley, will lead our discussion, and I hand it over to Stefania to introduce Bryan.
Thank you, Grant. My name is, as Grant says, Stefania Manfio, and I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology here at Stanford. And today, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce the speaker, Professor Bryan Wagner. Bryan Wagner is professor in English Department and American Studies program at the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on African-American expression in the context of slavery and its aftermath. And he has a secondary interest in legal history and vernacular culture. His books include Disturbing the Peace, Black Culture and Police Power After Slavery, Harvard University Press, The Tar Baby, A Global History, The Wild Chipitulas, and The Life and the Legend of Brass Coupé. He has also co-edited a collection of critical essays looking for law in all the wrong places, and is currently writing The People's Court, Law and Performance from Slavery to the Civil Rights Movement, a book that reconstructs a period-bound demotic tradition of Myriam jurisprudences. Professor Wagner is going to talk about today the Louisiana Slave Conspiracy Project. Please join me in welcoming Professor Wagner.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Grant and Stefania. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here with you all representing the team behind Louisiana slave conspiracies. I'll talk for, I think, about like 25, 30 minutes, and then I hope we can have a more open discussion. There are a lot of, I'll really focus on the substance of the web archive we've created. There are a lot of larger methodological and also institutional issues raised by the project, and so I'll mostly leave those for discussion. I should note that the material included in our website is difficult. You know, it's about people fighting for their lives, and our work aims to honor and to understand their struggle. Let me share my screen. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. Can you all see? Can you all see my screen? I hope you can. Yeah. There. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Excellent. So here you see Jacques Ballin's Carte de la Louisiane of 1757. Point Coupé, the location of the two conspiracies under consideration in our website, which is a little bit over 100 miles northwest from New Orleans. You can see on this map, it's marked in English translation as Cut Point here toward the center. So I will then read to you, this is our statement of purpose that has joined the collective. We are a collaborative, multidisciplinary project dedicated to preserving, digitizing, transcribing, translating, and analyzing manuscripts related to two slave conspiracies conceived and organized in 1791 and 1795 at the Point Coupé settlement in the Spanish territory of Louisiana. So today I'll describe our research process as well as the ways in which we've begun as a project to engage with epistemological problems endemic to the study of slave conspiracies, and also more broadly endemic to subaltern politics. We're a big group of people, more than 40 faculty, staff, graduate students, and undergraduates at UC Berkeley mostly, but also elsewhere, have been working on this project since 2017. It's a truly multidisciplinary collaboration with experts in language, history, geography, and data science coming together to address common problems. Members of the project have really different disciplinary training and therefore different approaches to the epistemological problems posed by our archive. This has been really an interesting part of the collaboration. Some of us are committed positivists, very interested in data and quantification. Others are critical and skeptical about the archive of slavery, and that's generated some really interesting conversations. I wanted to introduce to you all, though, some of our core collaborators. If you look at the top left image, from left to right, Amani Morrison, Gerard Ram, Shad Small, and Patty Frontera was our original group, with Gwendolyn Midlow Hall actually also presenting on Zoom at Harvard back in 2017. Patty, on the right of that image, has been our lead for mapping, and she's also been really essential to strategic planning for the project. She's now heading the D Lab at UC Berkeley. Next to Patty is Shad Small, who has been the lead programmer and data architect for the project. He's really done so much of the heavy lifting. He came onto the project as a graduate student in sociology. In the bottom left corner of your screen is Janelle Thomas, who has been our language lead. She came onto the project as a graduate student in Spanish and Portuguese. She's now at Oxford. She specializes in multilingualism in late 18th century Louisiana. So her expertise was just absolutely essential to our work here. There are lots of other people pictured here, including on the bottom right, Itzania Castro, Jordan D. Pasquale, and Brielle Brown, who are three of a very large number of undergraduates who worked on the project through our URAP program at Berkeley. Jane Henderson, a graduate student in geography, is above. So this is just to say, I need to really gesture to this collaborative group who've been so essential to the project. So I want to talk to you a little bit, though, about the basic facts as we understand them of these two conspiracies. There isn't a full monograph on these conspiracies. There are a few articles that have been published, mostly in the 1980s and 1990s, that disagree pretty intensely about the conspiracies. So we're very much a project that's about primary documents. But let me give you some orientation. So first, the 1791 conspiracy in Pointe Coupee. On July 9th, 1791, officials at Pointe Coupee learned that a group of enslaved people at their post were conspiring to revolt. The plan, as we understand it, was to steal weapons from Jean-Baptiste Tournoir's storehouse, kill their enslavers, and claim their freedom. This plan was formed at a late night dance held at the cabin of the enslaved man Juan Louis on the widow Robillard's estate. Everyone in attendance at the dance belonged to the Mina ethnic group. So crucially in 1791, we're talking about an ethnically organized conspiracy. The conspiracy was foiled, moreover, by inter-ethnic rivalry. Several members of the Ado ethnic group told their enslaver, Don Jorge Olivo, about the plot. And it was Olivo who told the post commandant Valentin Leblanc, which subsequently then led to a series of raids, with 17 people eventually arrested and charged with conspiracy. So with this 1791 conspiracy, there are two trials. The main documents we have available on our website are all trial documents. So we have the manuscripts from the two trials of the 1791 conspiracy. The first trial occurred in Pointe Coupee, again with a Valentin Leblanc acting as judge, interpreter, and scribe. The records from that first trial include full confessions and a detailed account of the conspiracy provided by the accused. Complaints were made almost immediately about irregularities in this first trial, and a second trial was scheduled in New Orleans with Governor Carondelet presiding. The accused conspirators were assigned a defense lawyer and 2 translators. After a long delay, the second trial began, at which the accused conspirators claimed that the confessions in the first trial were fabricated. They claimed they did not speak Creole French, the language in which the first trial was conducted. The second trial was protracted and delayed several times as the government turned to the pressing matters stemming from the French and Haitian revolutions. The Mina conspirators remained imprisoned in New Orleans until June 1794, when their enslavers back in Pointe Coupee finally secured their release. And so they returned. So there are a lot of kinds of problems as we engage these documents. We have 2 trials that tell very, very different stories about this conspiracy. Lots of language problems as well. That second trial, there are 2 sets of interpreters. So things are officially recorded in Spanish, but much of the trial is conducted in Mina, in that language, translated to French and then translated to Spanish. So the linguistic problems already with that archive are quite substantial. So that's the 1791 conspiracy. The 1795 conspiracy, also in Pointe Coupee, is a much larger event. In April 1795, 63 people were arrested in Pointe Coupee for planning a revolution. Their aim was to set fire to a shed on the Julien Poydras estate. Lying in wait, they would kill the whites who came to extinguish the fire, steal guns from the storehouse, and move from plantation to plantation, killing their former enslavers and gathering others to join the revolt. That's our best kind of summation of the plan. Compared to 1791, this was a much larger conspiracy. It was a multi-ethnic conspiracy, a multi-racial conspiracy that included a few whites and free persons of color who were dedicated to the ideals of the radical Enlightenment, were inspired by the French and Haitian revolutions. A school teacher named Joseph Boyavel was even accused of reading from the Declaration of the Rights of Man to an assembly of enslaved people gathered in the swamp outside Pointe Coupee. The conspiracy in 1795 was also betrayed, and after a crackdown, a trial began on May 4th. Following weeks of testimony, this is a very large archive of the second conspiracy, convictions were handed down for 57 enslaved individuals and 3 whites. 23 of the accused conspirators were hung and decapitated, and their heads were impaled on posts along the Mississippi River as a warning. The remaining conspirators were flogged, deported, and/or sentenced to labor. Okay, so those are the basic facts of the 2 conspiracies as we understand them. Let me talk to you a little bit about the website and its presentation of primary documents related to these conspiracies. I should say again, these are primarily trial documents. So we have the first 2 trials of 1791, and then there are also 2 trials in 1795, the big trial that happens in Pointe Coupee, and then there's a second trial that happens in New Orleans of Antoine Saracen, who's an accused ringleader of the 1795 conspiracy. I should also say, not coincidentally, but very interestingly, Antoine Saracen is not only the accused ringleader of the 1795 conspiracy, he's also the translator who was hired in New Orleans for the second 1791 trial. So he's tied in very interesting ways. On the website, though, the core is really a collection of 1,422 documents from these 4 conspiracy trials. You're looking here at the declaration of Francoise, who is a Tunica woman, so a Native American woman who is involved in betraying the 1795 conspiracy. You see here on the left the original page image as it exists in the archive. You see a transcription in French and then an English translation. The pane you see on the top there, you see document, to its left, information. This is information about this declaration that we have produced this data. This is the document metadata that tells you about the principal people at the trial, people mentioned in the document. So these are 2 different kinds of things. There are people who are in the room, but then people who are mentioned, places that are mentioned. And then you can see on the bottom right, a map of the places that are mentioned. You can see that the people and places are indicated as they appear in the document and as they are inferred from it. So sometimes, right, the name might not be said. It might say him or they, but we infer who those people are. So from here, so this is one of the things that we worked very hard to produce on the website is the kind of ability to navigate among documents, people, and places, right? So anywhere here, you can click on a person's name and it will take you then to a person page. So for instance, from here, you could click on Caesar's name, who is mentioned in this document, and it takes you to a page referring to him. The nomenclature we use, so Caesar is enslaved by the Frederick Leonard, and so this is what the nomenclature at the top of the page refers to. But so we're navigating then from that document, the testimony offered by Francoise, to information about this person, Caesar, who is enslaved to Frederick Leonard. You have here demographic information that we have been able to produce from the trial documents, but also from other documents that are part of our archive. Age, race, ethnicity. There's an awful lot of information about African ethnicities that are contained in these documents that are very important to the history of slavery in Louisiana. Gender, literacy, residence, kinship. You also have links to all of the principal testimonies Caesar gives at trial, as well as other documents in which he is mentioned. And also places with which he is associated, right? And so this starts to get complicated because some of those places are places where he is asserted to have been by others. So there are cases where, for instance, we have people who are asserted to have been in two places at the same time. This is the kind of epistemological challenge we face. We have these kinds of assertions that are made that are conflicting and contradictory. So from here, you can click on places on the map. So for instance, the Widow LaCour estate is one of the places associated with Caesar. So you can click there, navigating then from Caesar through that interactive map to the Widow LaCour estate. And here you have information on our geographical research and coordinates. So as well as associated people and documents. So again, here we're on a place page. You can move to documents and people associated with this place. We also have a full list of documents. So this is another way to navigate where you can search, browse, and filter documents. We also have a list of people, or a kind of census, where you can search, browse, and filter people involved in the two conspiracy trials. We were able to identify 272 people involved in these various trials. We also have an interactive map, which was quite an extraordinary process. I'll describe in a moment, to produce geospatial data to generate this map. The map, though, includes 42 places relevant to the two conspiracies. You can click again on any of those places for more information. Okay, so that's a very brief description of the functionality of the website. I want to talk to you a little bit about the research process and the data process, which was extraordinarily complex, more complex than I had anticipated at the beginning. I should say, I'm an English professor, as Stefania mentioned in the beginning, and so a lot of the methodologies involved in the construction of this archive were new to me, and really, depended upon the expertise of other team members. But as I was imagining things, I again and again, would imagine that things would be relatively simple and straightforward, and they turned out to be extraordinarily time-consuming and complex. And so, I might say that actually one of the most important things I learned through this process was some disciplinary humility. There's this kind of way in which I discovered that things that I discovered how much my colleagues knew and how difficult some of the problems they tackled were on a day-to-day basis. So let's talk about that research process, though, which was pretty complicated. The first step in it was collection and digitization. We have a complete set, again, of the documents from the 4 trials in digital facsimile. Transcriptions in the original language and English translation we produce. So produced by that team, using a kind of tiered process where a lot of the original transcription and translation was produced by undergraduates, but then was refined by graduate students who supervised the undergraduates, but then also made something more like a kind of proper copy. And then Janelle Thomas corrected and signed off on everything as our kind of lead language expert. There was a lot of work convincing the clerk of court's office in Pointe-Coupé to let us have these documents, allow us to put them on a truck and send them to Dallas where they were digitized. There were a lot of negotiations with archives that I was doing at the very start of the process. So just getting these documents together in the first place was really essential. And then transcribing and translating them was also an important collaborative phase in our work. The next phase, though, was data analysis. So our research team produced data on documents, persons, and places. We created document metadata by breaking manuscript collections into individual units, testimonies, letters, official acts, etc., with fields recording provenance and dates, locations, and all roles in the legal and scribal process. A demographic data set of persons was created by manually processing each document in the corpus one by one, identifying each individual, and where possible, linking them to the known persons already identified by historians, correcting errors, and resolving discrepancies in secondary sources as needed. This would be an example of the kind of problem that seemed to me rudimentary before we began. We spent so much time trying to figure out whether there were 1 or 2 enslaved people named Ata involved in the 1791 conspiracy. All previous historians had said there were 2 Atahs. We finally, after a lot of work, discovered that actually they were referring to 1 person. And so this is the kind of thing that required an extraordinary amount of labor, but we were happy to find that, that resolution. Building that demographic data set that required us to untangle a variety of aliases, as well as variant spellings of individual names, which reflected, among other things, overlapping language constituencies and overrepresentation of some names among the enslaved, in order to connect every mention of a person to a canonical name for use in data analysis. So that, again, extraordinarily complicated process. Supplemented by census records and estate inventories, our manuscripts provide detailed information about individuals, again, including race, ethnicity, gender, birthplace, birth date, status, occupation, enslaver, residence, literacy, verdict, sentence, and date of death, as well as roles played at trial and alleged role, if any, in a conspiracy. So this is our data model. This is what supports our website, which I should say is in Drupal. I can talk about the platform. The infrastructure for the website navigation, as well as our current work with network and narrative visualizations, is based in this model, which was really conceived and designed by Shad Small. Okay, so that's a bit about document metadata and demographic data. The geographical or geospatial research process was similarly fraught and fascinating. This is the process that led to that interactive map that I showed you all. In this process, there were 3 main challenges. First, our manuscripts on estates and other locations had names in French, English, and Spanish. As with our demographic data, we had to disambiguate references by identifying multiple aliases used for a single place. Second, there are no surviving historical maps of Pointe Coupee from the 1790s with sufficient detail to serve as a base map for our project. So what you see here, this is a map from 1796. But as you can see, it's just insufficiently detailed to serve as a base map for our purposes in trying to think through the geography of these conspiracies. The third challenge our geospatial research process faced is that the area's geography, including the course of the Mississippi River, has changed. So many locations relevant to the conspiracies are now in the river, right? And so there are things that one could do that we cannot because of those very significant changes. So faced with all of these challenges, we had to look up or look to early 19th century sources and work backward to the 1790s. This is Patty Frontero is really spearheading a lot of this work. An essential source for us then was the American State Papers, which included land claims from Pointe Coupee filed with the Congressional Board of Commissioners following the Louisiana Purchase. We also found six survey plat maps of Pointe Coupee dating to 1805, again, coming in the wake of the Louisiana Purchase. These maps then were merged, aligned, and georeferenced using the US Geological Survey vector files. So this was the kind of Frankenstein original map that we were working with. You can see the mosaic here. That resulting data set from that geospatial research process has been used to create this the interactive map that appears on our website. Again, interactive in that you can click on a place to be taken to a page describing the place with links to related persons and documents. The mosaic of plat maps combined and warped to reflect the 1790s is what you see on the website. So not only were we combining these and kind of thinking through the information we have in the early 19th century, we were also morphing and changing the map to match all of the available information we had, both from the original trial records, but also from other kinds of estate kinds of inventories. The website is currently really document heavy. It's essentially an archive. We're starting to work on some new strategies to interpret these documents, making them more immediately intelligible to users. The challenge here, again, it's a familiar challenge, is that the documents don't provide a clear picture of events, right? The testimonies are mostly rumor and speculation. There's a lot of hearsay. They're unreliable and contradictory. You know, that kind of unreliability is obviously a familiar problem in the study of slave conspiracies globally, including in places like Mauritius, right? As well as in other subaltern situations. And so one of the things we're hoping to do with the website is to find ways to clarify the several competing accounts of social organization and political imagination suggested by our sources. So in other words, we're much less focused on kind of proving once and for all what happened in 1791 and 1795. You know, we accept that there are many things about these conspiracies that may remain unknowable. Instead, we hope to present a range of scenarios suggested by our sources, integrating them with the website, not only as an annotation layer, but also as an aid to navigation. So to this end, we're beginning to experiment with narrative flowcharts that portray conditional forking plot sequences and network visualizations that present conspiratorial organization as a dynamic web. Our intention here, again, is to represent rather than reconcile competing accounts suggested by our evidence. So you see here a prototype we have of a network visualization. It's a dynamic web. So here, when you click on one of the nodes, the web recomposes itself to suggest what the conspiratorial network looks like from the point of view of that node. So it's a way then, and this will become an aid to navigation as well as an analytical tool. It's taken us a long time to get to this point. Looking back to 2017, again, when I started to get people together to work on the project, it's amazing, as I was saying, the degree to which I underestimated the work that would be required to build the project's foundations. And so it's really been the case that we've been so involved in the brass tacks of producing this archive together as an authentically interdisciplinary collaboration. And the more analytical work I've begun to describe to you still lies in our future. So I'm going to stop there. There are a lot of more things to say, but I think it would be nice for us to talk together, and I can talk both about, I'm happy to go on at length about any of the details of the substance of the project, but also address some kind of methodological and also institutional matters of collaboration that I'm sure are relevant to projects that others in the room or the virtual room have undertaken or are undertaking.
Thank you very much, Professor Wagner. It was really, really interesting. And if I can speak also for Grant, we are really looking close to your website to try to find a solution for what we'd like to do for our CAPE portal. Thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, I should say it's all open source. So Stefania, if you want anything, you can. It's on GitHub. You can have it. And we'd be very happy to talk with you all if there are any things, including design elements. But if there's anything that would be useful to you all, we'd be very happy to have that conversation to figure out how it might be helpful.
Oh, it would be wonderful, really. I think we can start to collect questions. Gerald, would you like to start first? Would you like to go?
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to start my video, but it's not reacting. I don't know. Oh, maybe it's working now. Bryan, thank you very much for that. It was, I'm not exaggerating, it's exhilarating because you've done what I have kind of been dreaming about. So I don't know if Grant and Stefania told you, but where we are coming from. So I and Nigel Worden did a volume of slave court cases some 15 years ago. And we are hoping to digitize this. And the model you've presented is, I think, it fits our aims and ideas perfectly. So I have a few very small questions to ask. So the first one, it's very impressive, the stuff you said at the end to kind of show to people, you know, you have to kind of move beyond the surface of the document. So what do you mean by a narrative flow chart? So I'm curious to know how that looks. And the other thing is, so you mentioned, so one of the things you do for each document, you have metadata. So for each person, you can click on the name and then you kind of get biographical information. So where did you source that information? Is this something that for Louisiana, I know almost nothing about the history of slavery in Louisiana. Is it readily available, or did you have to do a lot of extra archival research? And then the third point, which is very minor, but it kind of speaks to a frustration of mine in that I am separated, like most of my colleagues, from my archive. So you mentioned that you had to take the documents physically from, I think, somewhere in Louisiana to Texas, to Texas. And did you scan them? Did you photograph them? What was the process there? Because in our case, I was the one who transcribed all these documents. I had to go, I was bound by the opening hours of the archives, and I had to sit with the volume next to me, and transcribe, typing away. So yeah, I'm amazed that they gave you permission. I have to say, it would not happen here, I think. But thank you. It is really inspiring, and I look forward to exploring your website in greater detail. Thank you.
So should I go ahead and address? Yeah, thank you, Gerald, for those amazing questions, and also for your exhilaration. I'd love to talk to you about what you're doing. It does sound like there's a lot of affinity between the projects. So to the I need to remember the three questions. To the first question, so okay, let me remember what they are. The third question was about the document process and how that happened. The second question, what have I forgotten them? I got excited for a second. Gerald, remind me what the three questions are very quickly.
Yeah, so just briefly to recap, the one was about how did you copy the original documents? Secondly, the metadata. Do you have, like scholarship available that you could easily tap? And third, about what do you mean by a narrative flowchart?
Okay, great. I'll take them actually in the order you originally presented them. So narrative flowchart. So there are these very something I find somewhat frustrating in the scholarship on slave conspiracies is it's often this very kind of binary thing. I think maybe the classic case is Denmark VC and the kind of debate, like, did the conspiracy happen or not? There are all these smaller questions in the archival documents we have, like, who led the second phase of the 1795 conspiracy? Was it Antoine Saracen or was it Jean-Baptiste? And those two, both Jean-Baptiste and Antoine Saracen, have other enslaved people who are kind of part of their friend groups who offer very competing accounts of what happened, arguing that one or the other was the leader of that phase of the conspiracy. So a narrative flowchart would simply be, just a kind of set of lines where where it's like choose your own adventure, where you're clicking on different lines depending upon which kind of set of testimonies you're following. So the story actually then has points of intersection where there's an agreement that a particular event happened, like there's a gathering, that it's like a show of force that happens at the church in 1795. People agree that happened, but the events flowing into the show of force and out of it, there's some interesting disagreement that can be, I think, specified. It's not like infinite disagreement or vagueness, right? They're actually narrative lines that testimonies will kind of coalesce around. So if that helps a little bit to describe what a narrative flowchart would look like with those kinds of forking paths. In terms of, yes, there is secondary data. Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, who was an early, incredibly helpful and collaborator, who remains one of our crucial collaborators, produced a very early digital humanities project called the Louisiana Slave Database in the 1990s that she published on a CD-ROM, which is a demographic database of enslaved people in Louisiana, really focused on the 18th century, moving into the beginning of the 19th century. So through Gwen's database, which points to a bunch of primary sources, we really had ready access to a lot of this demographic information. It's also the case, though, that these court records, which are in so many ways kind of informal, like they don't look like, the kind of normal juridical process we associate with adversarial court situations. They do, however, write down a lot of this information. So they will always identify the ethnic group. They will always they'll identify age as best they can, literacy, these kinds of things. So at the beginning of every testimonial document, there is actually a set of demographic, traits that are adduced in the conversation. That said, we did have to go outside to other kinds of documents, primary documents. We would always go all the way there. But Gwen's work in particular, but also some other writings that have happened on on Louisiana slavery in the late 18th century were helpful to us. It is true that the archive of slavery in Louisiana at that time is unusually detailed. This has a lot to do with the fact that we're talking about a French and then Spanish territory. So in particular, ecclesiastical documents, associated with the Catholic Church provide a kind of different degree of demographic data than you find in, say, a place like Virginia in the United States. So that's all really important. In terms of the document process, yeah, it was in some ways, so we had some good success. So some of these things were already available in certain places. The big trials, or no, sorry, the big trial, the 1795 trial, had actually been microfilmed by the Mormons in the 1960s. But the quality of that, even with the better microfilm machines you have now, was not great. Like a lot of the problems we encountered in the previous chapters and articles about the conspiracy actually resulted, I think, from poor transcription and translation because of the bad quality of those original prints. So we made the decision pretty early on that we needed to reprint everything because we wanted to see it much more clearly. And so that involved some negotiations with some people who were skeptical initially, but over time became excited about the project. I should have said more about how extraordinarily important Julie Lee and Bryan Costello in New Roads in Point Coupé are. It's a place where people really love their local history. I talk to people about this all the time when people are doing very, very local projects. It's kind of amazing when you find people who are so dedicated to the history of their own place. And so they were essential to winning the cooperation of the clerk of court's office, and were, just extraordinary resources throughout the project and extraordinary supporters. We did run into another strange complication, which is that after we based all of our data on the records at the courthouse, which were scribal copies, right? So as you know, these kinds of documents are copied. We were working from the scribal copies, which are the only documents any historians had ever seen before. We discovered the originals, which were housed in New Orleans in the Jazz Museum, of all places. So we now have also a second set of the 1795 conspiracy trial, at least. And there are not super significant differences, but this was another layer of complexity we have yet to kind of really reckon with. So we now have we're the first people studying these conspiracies to work with both the original trial record and the scribal copies. So there's that additional layer. Right now on the website, you're looking at the scribal copies, which is where we began.
Thank you very much, Bryan. It is fascinating. Just one small point. It seems that your records are very similar to the ones that we look at, and that they're influenced by Roman law. So also they start off with this thing about, a male person of this age working for so-and-so, and they give some kind of description. So it's very interesting. I think there are interesting points of comparison. But thank you once again for a really fascinating talk.
Yeah, and Gerald, let's follow up. That sounds great.
Hello, Richard. Would you like to go next?
Thank you, Bryan. This is really fascinating and gives us a plan for how to proceed with the records we have regarding liberation records in Senegal. But there are a couple of things I'd like to mention to you, and that is, I wonder if you know Ibrahima Seck at the Whitney Plantation.
Yes. So Ibrahim is a very good friend, and I actually in the fall was doing a project working on their records, producing a demographic data set of people who were enslaved on that plantation, also elsewhere in St. John Parish. So yeah, so the answer is yes, and he is not only a friend, he's also a collaborator.
Excellent. And I was thinking about James Sweet's book.
Yeah.
Dominguez Alvarez.
Yes.
And one of the fascinating things about that book, of course, is the way in which he traces these Dominguez Alvarez in Brazil back to Africa. Yeah. Have you thought at all about adding the Africa dimension to this?
Yeah.
Because this is one of the fascinating things that we now are better able to do, given some of the transatlantic slave trade database. But it would be a wonderful way of looking at this idea of, because you're looking at race and ethnicity, right? Whatever that means, and how that's reconstituted through this whole process of enslavement and settlement in these plantations.
Absolutely. No, that's such an important point. And, they're all like, what counts as MENA ethnicity is so contested and complicated, for example. The way we're going about that is, so we're part of the Enslaved Consortium. So we're not up there yet, when we're not linked to all of those other data sets, but we're hoping that, rather than doing it on our own, we're interested in seeing whether all of those other data sets will suggest some of those correspondences. The way the kind of history of importation of enslaved people to Louisiana is also very complicated. It actually, comes, you have a big wave that comes, through kind of centralized planning early in the years of the French colonization of Louisiana. And then it's right around, this early 1790s, you have a massive new wave of people. It has to do with the processing of sugar, and, and they're coming from different places, Senegambia earlier, and then from Congo later on. And so there's a lot to say about it. The way right now it's something we're thought a lot about. Gwen Midlow Hall has written much about it in relationship to Louisiana, not only several books on it. The way we're thinking about it right now is we're interested to see whether correspondences suggest themselves once we're linked up to the enslaved project, and it's an open kind of question. It may be that we don't get one-to-one correspondences where we can start to trace individuals, right, to particular voyages, but we'll see. But there's no question that it's really essential, and it's one of the things that is complicated and really powerful about studying the Louisiana context. These kinds of connections to particular places in Africa are really powerful and have been very carefully documented by scholars.
Thank you. Laura, I think you're next.
Thanks, Stefania. Thank you, Brian, for coming and speaking with us. Like Gerald, I found this truly exhilarating. I'm part of the team that's working on what we're not sure about yet, but trying to think about this particular collection of trials of enslaved people at the Cape of Good Hope. And I'm doing a related project that's on a slave rebellion in the 19th century. And it's a much smaller space, but some of what you have already accomplished is the stuff I have been doing for the last 3 or 4 months, trying to chart it out. And it's really fun to see what can happen with a big team going forward. And my question for you, which is an in the weeds historian's question. So, if you need to punt it away, that's fine. You had mentioned a person called Atta, I think was that name. How did you decide that there was one Atta with an alias or, an avatar rather than 2 Attas?
Oh my gosh. I can't remember. But which tells you some. It was. I need to remember. I wish Shad were here. He could tell us. I can't remember. But it's actually something I need to remember how we did that. But it was. I want to say for 6 months we had something in our meetings when we would just somehow the problem of the 2 Attas would come up, There was a smoking gun. I'm sorry, I really wish I could recall, but there was some smoking, or there was something that we had thought about before, but then Shad pointed out that it resolved the question. So I can't remember exactly how it was done.
Well, in your free time, if you want to write a paper about that piece, I think there's a lot of dorky empiricist historians who would really be interested, right? Because as you know, this sort of evidence is really fragmentary and we're all doing our best guessing.
Yeah.
I think most of us in good faith.
Yeah.
But in the end, you just make a decision.
Yeah. That point too is really, we really felt that piece of it. And this is where like the multidisciplinary aspect of it was really interesting to me, because the best guess that you're describing is very much the kind of approach that we took, but where you're trying to actually get precise about what really happened, right? So it's a more kind of empiricist approach that was common actually to many people on the project, where, for instance, with the map, a lot of the map, even though we had this very complicated research process where we were integrating various sources from 2 time periods together, they were best guesses, to use your term. But the thing that's interesting to me is literature person, right, is that like we as a discipline have a very different relationship to uncertainty, right? Like, so in English, like we like uncertainty, like, so like it's all, there are most, I would say, canonical methodologies in literature really don't know what to do until you've identified a point of uncertainty that you can characterize as irony or a paradox or kind of some kind of more conceptual impasse. If you're, kind of more ambitious, that's when interpretation begins, right? So like I'm trained to actually look for uncertainty and to kind of like build interpretations around a point that is unknowable. Right. And so for me, this is where I began with these documents, like thinking about the historiographical debates about conspiracies where you really don't know what happened, and thinking about what literary methodologies might bring to that conversation. I quickly found, though, that I needed to be working with people who had a very different relationship to uncertainty, where it was always about trying to reduce uncertainty as close as possible to zero. Right. And so how those different methodologies work together is really interesting. And mostly, I would say, or almost entirely, what we have so far is really the kind of best guess approach, or in the case of the two Etats, really, kind of sealing the deal, of saying we can say this for sure. But which for me is a kind of, it's an unfamiliar kind of way of going about things, but given the task at hand was absolutely necessary. So for me, that was really, people talk about interdisciplinary work all the time in my universe, which is like pretty much compatible methodologies in the humanities and social sciences kind of working together. This was for me just like totally fascinating to work with people who had wildly different kind of methodological assumptions about precisely this, the kind of question of a best guess, or kind of one's approach to things that may or may not be knowable.
Thanks.
Carrie, would you like to go next?
I also, it was wonderful to see a kind of exemplary project on the kinds of things we've been thinking about, especially because Rice University in Texas, if anyone wants to bring their archival documents to Texas, y'all can just, contact me. But I'm going to go from the subtle questions to the kind of nuts and bolts. Rice now houses the slave voyages database. And I asked Daniel Dominguez about the slave trade database, just a ballpark figure of how much it had cost in its entirety. And he kind of said around $5 million so far. And there's another spatial data project that's housed at Rice with cooperation. They're all kind of multidisciplinary and somewhat multi-institutional projects called Imagine Rio, which does a kind of time lapse of the evolution of Rio as a city with geospatial data, historical databases, right? It's searchable. And that's much smaller, just, on Rio. And that had cost $500,000 over the last 5 years. And so thinking about this kind of scale of project, can you share with us some of the challenges of funding? So that's one of the issues, because you've got an enormous team, and I'm not talking about calculating labor costs. I'm talking about maintenance of the websites and creating, the data for use. Not, yeah. And like Gerald, I'm going to take advantage of a 3-point question. Again, it's nuts and bolts about who do you envisage using your project? Who are you kind of framing it for? And one of the things that I think the slave voyages database has been really interesting in is having user feedback. So they actually have user feedback kind of portal so that the users can comment and they can track from their user feedback who's using the database and help answer questions if necessary, or point them to other resources. And also that particular project has been really forward thinking. I mean, it's been around for a long time now in terms of connecting schools, or connecting to resources that can be used at different educational levels. So could you just explore that kind of, universe of your project, or to do, a wish list of how you would see this if you, Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie. Those are great, and actually also very intimately related questions. The question of funding and the question of audience are, especially the kind of point where we are now, really related to one another. So I would say ballpark, this costs something like $280,000. A lot of which, and most of the money was from NEH. There were 2 NEH grants. And then there was money from the Mellon Foundation that came through a digital humanities initiative at Berkeley. There were a lot of other smaller things that were cobbled together. Those are the main sources. I should also say we're right now out of money, and so this is part of the kind of there's an interesting thing about the duration of these kinds of projects. Like there was a moment when we had people together and we had funding to make stuff happen. I should say, all we pay everybody, at Berkeley, staff support, you need to pay for it through a grant. It's not the case that we have people whose job it is to help us. We pay all of our graduate students. I will say that one important trick to how we were able to do as much as we did with the money we had available was the undergraduate researchers who were receiving academic credit rather than money, who were a big team of people, many of whom were incredibly capable. Berkeley has a dual degree program with Sciences Po. And so those students, many of them were native or near native, both in French and Spanish. So there was an extraordinary amount of work that happened that way. And again, it happened in a tiered system where the people who were really managing the undergraduates were graduate students. And then for the language process, Janelle, kind of oversaw everything. And so there was something, I think there was some kind of economy of scale that was happening there that made things work well. Initially, I was definitely imagining this more as a kind of public history project. And what would make that possible, I think, would be a lot more visualization and a lot more, where you're looking at the forking paths or the networks. And I would imagine a lot of users would spend a lot of their time there rather than drilling all the way down into the primary documents. But because, it's like, so we don't have any money right now. I'm doing 3 other projects. People have kind of scattered and are doing projects. It's a kind of challenging moment because we don't have anyone who's really, really focused on the next phase of this project, just to be like wildly open and candid about what's going on, and so sustaining the funding over time feels really difficult. Like we're fortunate in some ways. There was a lot of interest in digital humanities at Berkeley when I was initially doing the project, and there was funding available. How to keep it going, it started in 2017, how to keep it going into the next phase is a challenge, especially when kind of the first phase turned out to be about real brass tacks, and the things that we had envisioned in the very beginning still remain in our future. So there are challenges there about personnel, kind of finding new people who really want to jump in now, but then also finding funding for a next phase that's just also about things like maintenance. We're in Drupal 7, so we're a little bit of a vestigial, and so I think these are challenges that all digital humanities projects face, but we're in a particular moment where we're feeling some pressures keeping the project going.
Yeah, I think that's really part of the conversation that I've been having with other people who have done these large scale or even medium scale projects is sustainability over time. Once the exciting kind of, we're part of building it from the ground up, how do you sustain it over time? It's challenging. One of the users, though, I think that would be interested, well, I find in my work on the Indian Ocean, I get contacted by people trying to do genealogical research. The genealogists love drilling down into the documents. So, there's a huge audience, that kind of public-facing connection, I think. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the people in Point Coupé who live there now love their history, and so like some of the best most exhilarating, kind of moments have come sharing the work with them, or like having them bring things to us that just blew our minds. Brian Costello and Julie Lee we would be knocking our heads against something, and we'll say, let's just like send them an email quickly, and they would know for the most fascinating reasons, that through even something like what we might call oral history. So yes, absolutely, the kind of genealogical aspect, but also kind of enthusiasts for local history are such kind of important kind of partners, for this kind of project. And absolutely, in terms of the engagement, we have a big, juicy feedback button. So we are collecting, it's both collecting information about users, but on any page on our website, we're trying to get people to tell us what they're doing, what they're thinking, but also correcting us if we've done something that they see as wrong.
So we're reaching the end of our time, but I see Laura had a question for Kate or Gerald, so which is relevant to the broader methodologies we're discussing here. Kate or Gerald, would you like to say anything about that?
I'm happy to say something, but I don't know very much. But firstly, thank you so much, Brian, for such a fascinating and really exciting presentation. I hadn't seen your site before, but I'm so looking forward to spending some time there. Laura, to your question about TANUP, I don't know what's happened, but I haven't been able to access it for a while now. So no, I don't know, sadly, but it's something that hopefully can get fixed. Yeah, I don't know if Gerald knows more.
No, Kate, I don't. It's news to me because it's probably been like 2 or 3 weeks since I last looked at those sites, and they were working then. But thank God for those old-fashioned scholars among us. Both of those data sets are available on CD-ROM, which I have downloaded to several other types of interfaces. So, it's not all lost, but hopefully it's just a temporary glitch. But this is, as you say, it's a problem because when we undertook the inventory project, it was on the understanding that, because TANUP, I think, is supported by the National Archives in The Hague, and the quid pro quo was we would give them the data, but they will, in perpetuity, keep it available. So maybe they're just moving to a new platform or something.
Well, Gerald, it's interesting that it worked for you a couple of weeks ago, because I haven't been able to get it to work for months.
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah,
okay. Yeah. Maybe I'm misremembering. It may be 2 months ago.
Yeah, well, if you guys don't know, then I think when we don't have to take up people's time here, it's not just me that can't figure it out. Let's talk offline and figure out who to write to.
I'm just looking at it now, Laura. It's up. It's back up.
No, fantastic. Thanks, Carrie.
Well, let that be a reminder that we should help each other, not only in practical ways, but draw inspiration from what our colleagues are doing. And in this case, I'm ashamed to say that sitting on the other side of the bay, I'm a newcomer to your fantastic work, Brian. It's wonderful to see what you're doing, and it's so useful to hear your insights and to benefit from your wisdom. And I can only, I know I'm speaking not only for myself, but also for others on the Zoom room and others who will yet watch this video. I'm sure that there's much scope to continue the conversation further. And I very much look forward to that. Thank you very much indeed, Brian.
Thank you all so much. It was so great talking to you all.
Thank you. It was very exciting.
Thank you, Gay. I would just remind you that we are going to see in 4 weeks with Professor Roberts and with the Senegal project. You're going to receive more information from me soon.
Thank you.
Thank you to be here. Thank you again.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.